Go ahead, tear it down. That was the moment I knew the HOA had made the biggest mistake of their lives. The sound of heavy machinery echoed across my property that morning as I stood near the edge of my driveway and watched a group of workers prepare to remove the bridge that connected my land to the main access road. My name is Grant Walker, and for years that bridge had been the quiet entrance to my 120-acre property outside a small rural community. It was not flashy, it was not new, and it was not something most people would notice when driving past, but it represented decades of history, family memories, and careful maintenance. The person standing beside the equipment that morning was Victoria Beaumont, the president of the local homeowners association. She arrived wearing one of her usual expensive designer outfits, covered in bright patterns and luxury accessories that made her impossible to ignore. Victoria had always carried herself like every street, every fence, and every piece of land in the area belonged to her. She looked at the bridge with a satisfied smile and told the workers they finally had permission to remove what she called an unauthorized structure. Most people would have expected me to argue, call the authorities, or try to stop everything immediately. But I did something that confused everyone watching. I stepped back. I let them continue. Victoria noticed my silence and assumed it meant she had won. She turned toward the neighbors who had gathered nearby and confidently explained that the HOA was protecting property values and correcting a mistake that had existed for years. She claimed the bridge was built without proper approval and that the HOA had every right to take action. Several residents nodded because they trusted her confidence. That was Victoria's greatest strength. She could walk into any situation, speak with complete certainty, and make people believe she already had the answer. But there was one thing she did not know. The bridge she was destroying was not actually mine. Years earlier, when I purchased the property, the bridge was already there. I repaired the wooden rails, maintained the surface, and kept the area safe because I used it every day. Everyone naturally assumed it belonged to me because it sat at the entrance of my land. Even I had never questioned why the original records were so difficult to find. My father had always told me that old properties sometimes carried forgotten stories, and I was about to learn exactly what he meant. Victoria had spent months sending letters, demanding documents, and insisting that I remove the bridge myself. I had answered every request calmly, explaining that the ownership details were more complicated than she understood. She ignored that completely. To her, a confident accusation was more valuable than actual evidence. As the workers began preparing the area, Victoria walked over to me and said she expected me to be angry. She wanted a reaction. She wanted a confrontation that would prove her version of events. Instead, I simply looked at the bridge one more time and told her, "If you are certain this belongs to the HOA, then you should have no problem proving it." She laughed and said the paperwork was already handled. She believed the story was over. She believed she had removed my problem. What she did not realize was that she had just uncovered a much bigger question. Who really owned that bridge? And when the answer finally came out, it would change everything Victoria thought she knew. The morning after the bridge removal began, I expected questions from the neighbors, but I did not expect how quickly the story would spread through the community. By sunrise, people were already talking about what had happened. Some believed Victoria Beaumont had solved a problem that had been ignored for years. Others wondered why I had not fought harder to stop it. From the outside, it looked like I had simply allowed the homeowners association to take control. What nobody understood was that I had been waiting for one thing: the truth to come out. I spent the first few hours walking along the empty space where the bridge had stood. The land looked different without it, but my attention was not focused on what was missing. I was thinking about what the bridge represented and why so many records surrounding it were unclear. When I bought my property, the previous owner mentioned that the bridge had been there for generations. He told me it was older than most of the homes in the area and that many people had relied on it over the years. I maintained it because I believed it was part of the responsibility that came with owning the property. But there was always something unusual about the paperwork. The documents showed access rights, maintenance notes, and references to an older construction project, but they never clearly listed the bridge as my personal property. I had noticed that detail years before, but because nobody had challenged it, I never had a reason to investigate further. Victoria saw uncertainty as an opportunity. She believed that if something was not clearly labeled as private property, then she could claim authority over it. That was how she operated. She did not search for answers. She searched for control. Later that afternoon, I received another message from the Homeowners Association demanding that I acknowledge their decision and accept responsibility for any future issues related to the bridge area. I read the message carefully and noticed something important. They were confident about their power, but they never included the one thing that mattered most: proof of ownership. That was when I decided it was time to look deeper. I went through old property records, county files, and archived documents connected to the land. The search was not simple. Some records were decades old, and some references were written in ways that required patience to understand. After several hours, I found something that caught my attention. There were repeated mentions of a regional access project connected to the original development of the area. The documents did not describe the bridge as belonging to any homeowner, and they did not mention the Homeowners Association because it did not even exist when the bridge was first constructed. I printed the records and placed them on my desk. For the first time, I began to see the bigger picture. Victoria had assumed ownership because the bridge was located near my property. She never considered that location and ownership were two completely different things. The next morning, I called someone who specialized in reviewing old infrastructure records. I did not explain everything over the phone. I simply provided the document numbers and asked one question. Can you tell me who legally owns this structure? The answer would not come immediately, but I already knew one thing. Victoria had celebrated too early. She thought she had removed a problem from my property. She did not realize she had created a much larger question that would soon involve people far beyond our neighborhood. And once the official records were examined, the entire community would have to face a truth that nobody expected. The answer I was looking for did not come from a guess, a rumor, or a heated argument with Victoria Beaumont. It came from a phone call that changed the entire direction of the situation. 2 days after the bridge was removed, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by copies of old property records, county documents, and maintenance reports. The empty space where the bridge once stood was visible through the window, but my attention was focused on the paperwork in front of me. I had learned one important lesson from dealing with Victoria. Confidence did not replace evidence. The person who had the strongest documents would always have the strongest position. The specialist I contacted finally returned my call that afternoon. His name was Daniel Harper, and he had spent years reviewing historical records for old transportation and infrastructure projects. He did not start the conversation by giving me an answer. Instead, he asked several questions about the property, the location of the bridge, and the timeline of construction. After reviewing the information, he told me something that immediately changed how I viewed everything. The bridge had never been recorded as a private structure. It was connected to an old public access project that existed long before the neighborhood around me was developed. I asked him to explain what that meant in simple terms. His answer was clear. The bridge may have sat beside my land, but that did not automatically make it mine. More importantly, it also did not make it the HOA's property. I looked back at the messages Victoria had sent over the past few months. Every letter had the same pattern. She used words like unauthorized, improper, and community violation, but she never provided a document proving ownership. She had built her entire argument on an assumption. Meanwhile, I had unknowingly been maintaining something that belonged to a much larger system. I knew I needed to confirm everything before taking another step. So I requested official copies of the archived records connected to the original construction. The process took time because the files were stored through different departments, but each document revealed another piece of the puzzle. The bridge had been part of a regional connection plan created decades earlier. It was built before the HOA existed, before many of the nearby homes were constructed, and before Victoria ever had a position of authority. While I was gathering information, Victoria was doing exactly what I expected. She was celebrating. She organized a neighborhood meeting and told residents that the HOA had successfully removed a structure that had supposedly caused problems for years. She presented herself as the person who had protected the community. She never mentioned that she had not verified ownership before giving the order. She never mentioned that the records were still being reviewed. She simply moved forward as if the matter was finished. But I knew it was far from finished. The next morning, I received another update from Daniel. He had located additional records that required a closer review. There was a government identification number connected to the bridge project, along with historical maintenance references that had been archived for decades. That was the moment I realized this situation was much bigger than a disagreement between a homeowner and an HOA president. Victoria believed she had removed my bridge. She believed she had won a battle over property rights. But she never stopped to ask the one question that mattered most. What if the bridge was never ours to take? The first official review started quietly, but I could feel that everything around the bridge was about to change. A week earlier, Victoria Beaumont had been standing in front of the neighborhood acting like she had solved a major problem. Now she was still telling everyone the same story, but the documents behind the scenes were telling a completely different one. After Daniel Harper confirmed the existence of historical records connected to the bridge, he recommended that I request a formal site review. I agreed because I wanted facts, not assumptions. The next morning, a small team arrived to inspect the area. They were not there to create drama or take sides. They were there to compare the current location with the official records that had been stored for decades. I watched from a distance as they measured the remaining structure area, checked old maps, and reviewed the information connected to the original construction project. Victoria arrived shortly after and immediately noticed something was different. She walked toward the group wearing another expensive outfit with bright colors and carefully chosen accessories, expecting the same kind of attention she usually received at HOA meetings. She asked what was happening and why nobody had informed her. One of the reviewers calmly explained that they were verifying historical ownership information related to the bridge. That answer changed her expression for a moment. She quickly returned to her confident attitude and said the HOA had already handled the matter. She repeated that the bridge was an unauthorized structure and that the removal had been approved. But this time, her words did not carry the same weight. The reviewers were not interested in opinions. They were interested in records. As the inspection continued, they discovered several details that had been overlooked. The location matched old transportation maps. The construction dates matched a public infrastructure timeline. The maintenance references pointed toward a government-managed project rather than a private homeowner improvement. I stood there listening as the pieces connected one by one. For years, everyone had looked at the bridge from the surface. It crossed the edge of my property, so people assumed it belonged to me. Victoria saw the same thing and decided that assumption was enough. But ownership was never determined by appearance. It was determined by documentation. Later that afternoon, Daniel called me with another update. He explained that the identification number found in the archived files was connected to a government infrastructure database. The bridge had been tracked as part of a larger access system long before my property changed hands. I thanked him and looked outside at the empty space where the bridge used to stand. I was not angry. I was focused. The situation was no longer about proving Victoria wrong. It was about making sure the truth was recognized. Meanwhile, Victoria continued telling neighbors that the inspection was unnecessary and that the HOA had followed the correct process. But more people were beginning to ask questions. Some residents started reviewing the meeting notes and noticed that the HOA board had approved the removal without presenting any ownership documents. The confidence that once made Victoria seem powerful was slowly becoming the reason people questioned her decisions. She had built everything on certainty, but certainty without proof could collapse quickly. And now, for the first time since the bridge was removed, the official evidence was beginning to reveal who had actually made the mistake. The truth about the bridge did not arrive with a dramatic announcement. It arrived through a stack of official documents that quietly changed everything. A few days after the site review, Daniel Harper contacted me and asked if I could meet him at the county records office. He told me that the information they found was more important than anyone expected. I arrived early that morning and sat across from him as he placed several copies of archived records on the table. For years, people had looked at that bridge and made assumptions based on what they could see. Now, for the first time, we were looking at what was officially recorded. Daniel pointed to a section of the documents that showed the original construction history. The bridge was connected to a government-managed access project created decades before the neighborhood existed. The records included construction details, maintenance references, and an identification number assigned to the structure. That number was the detail that changed the entire situation. The bridge was not listed under my name. It was not listed under the HOA. It belonged to a government infrastructure system. I sat there for a moment thinking about how easily the mistake had happened. The bridge crossed near my property. I maintained it. My neighbors used it as a reference point for my land. Over time, Everyone simply accepted the idea that it belonged to me. Victoria Beaumont made the same assumption, but instead of investigating, she acted on it. She took uncertainty and treated it like permission. When I returned home that afternoon, I noticed the neighborhood atmosphere had already started changing. The same people who had congratulated Victoria were now asking questions. Some residents had reviewed the HOA meeting records and discovered that there had never been a verified ownership report before the removal decision was made. The board had approved a major action based on a belief, not evidence. Victoria did not like the attention moving in that direction. She called another meeting and attempted to reassure everyone that the HOA had acted responsibly. She explained that they had only removed what they believed was an improper structure. But that statement created another problem. Believing something and proving something were two completely different things. I attended the meeting quietly and listened. I did not need to argue. The documents already spoke for themselves. When Victoria finished explaining her position, I placed copies of the official records on the table. I told everyone that the bridge had never been my private property, but it had also never belonged to the HOA. The room became silent. For the first time, many residents understood the mistake that had been made. The bridge they thought was a neighborhood issue was actually connected to a much larger public system. Victoria looked through the documents carefully, searching for something that supported her original claim. But the more she read, the harder it became to ignore the reality in front of her. She had spent months presenting herself as the person protecting the community. Now everyone was beginning to see that she had acted without confirming the most important detail. Later that evening, Daniel sent me one final update. The government agency responsible for the bridge records had officially requested information about the removal. They wanted to understand how a public structure had been taken down without proper verification. That was the moment I realized the situation had moved far beyond a disagreement with the HOA. Victoria thought she was ending a problem that belonged to me. Instead, she had created a question that would soon require answers from everyone involved. The questions surrounding the bridge quickly moved beyond our neighborhood, and for the first time, Victoria Beaumont could not simply control the conversation. A few days after the government agency requested information, representatives began reviewing every step that led to the removal decision. They wanted to understand how the HOA approved the action, what documents were reviewed, and who authorized the work. The process was not about creating conflict. It was about finding out how a major mistake happened. I watched from a distance as the situation changed. The same confidence Victoria had shown when she stood beside the equipment was starting to disappear. She was no longer announcing victories at neighborhood meetings. Instead, she was answering questions she had avoided before. The first major issue was the approval process. The HOA board had voted to remove the bridge, but the meeting records showed that no official ownership verification had been completed before the decision was made. They had relied on assumptions and complaints instead of confirmed information. That detail became extremely important because the entire argument behind the removal depended on the idea that the bridge belonged to someone who did not have permission to keep it. Without proof of ownership, the foundation of Victoria's decision started to fall apart. Then came the contractor records. The company that removed the bridge provided copies of the instructions they received from the HOA. Those documents showed that the project was presented as an HOA-approved correction of a community issue. The contractor believed they were following a legitimate request because the HOA represented itself as having authority over the matter. But once the ownership records were reviewed, the contractor also realized they had been working from incomplete information. Nobody had stopped to ask the most basic question before taking action. Who actually had the legal authority to make that decision? Victoria attempted to explain that she was only protecting the community. She said she acted based on the information available at the time. But the problem was that she had ignored opportunities to verify that information. I remembered every conversation we had before the bridge was removed. I had told her the ownership records were complicated. I had explained that the bridge history was unusual. Instead of investigating further, she treated my uncertainty as proof that she was right. That was the mistake that changed everything. Meanwhile, residents began reviewing old HOA communications. Some discovered emails where Victoria pushed for immediate action because she wanted the issue resolved quickly. Others noticed that the board discussion focused more on removing the bridge than understanding its history. The pattern became clear. The decision was driven by confidence and urgency, not careful research. One evening, Daniel called me with another update. He explained that the government agency had completed its initial review and confirmed that the bridge was part of a public infrastructure system. They also requested additional information about the removal process and the people involved in approving it. I thanked him and sat quietly for a moment. I thought about how different everything could have been if Victoria had simply asked one more question before making her decision. A single phone call, a single document review, or a single request for clarification could have prevented the entire situation. But she wanted to be seen as the person with all the answers. Now, the records were showing that she had acted without having the most important answer of all. The bridge was never a battle over my property. It was a lesson about what happens when authority is used without responsibility. And as the investigation continued, more details about the HOA's decision-making process were about to come to light. The investigation continued for several weeks, and every new document made the situation more complicated for Victoria Beaumont. What started as an HOA decision to remove what they believed was an unauthorized structure had become a detailed review of how that decision was made. The focus was no longer on the bridge itself. The focus was on the process that allowed it to happen. I watched as the confidence that once surrounded Victoria slowly faded. She was still trying to present herself as the person who protected the neighborhood, but more residents were beginning to question whether she had actually protected anything at all. The government agency reviewing the matter requested copies of the HOA meeting records, contractor agreements, emails, and any documents related to ownership verification. The HOA had to provide everything connected to the decision. At first, Victoria insisted that the records would prove they had done nothing wrong. She believed the documents would show that the board acted responsibly. But when the records were reviewed, they revealed a very different story. The meeting notes showed repeated discussions about removing the bridge, but they contained no evidence that anyone had confirmed ownership. Several board members had asked whether the HOA actually had authority over the structure, but those concerns were dismissed because Victoria believed the answer was obvious. That detail became one of the most important parts of the review. The problem was not that someone misunderstood a document. The problem was that the HOA never made sure the information was correct before acting. Then came the financial questions. The contractor who removed the bridge had completed the work based on the HOA's instructions. The project had required planning, equipment, and labor costs. Once the ownership issue became clear, everyone involved wanted to understand who would be responsible for those expenses. The HOA board members began realizing that the decision they approved was not a simple neighborhood improvement project. It was an action involving a structure connected to public infrastructure. The responsibility was much larger than they expected. Some residents who had supported Victoria started changing their opinions. They had trusted her because she spoke with confidence and always appeared prepared. But confidence alone could not replace careful decision-making. Several neighbors admitted they never asked to see the ownership documents because they assumed Victoria had already verified everything. That assumption was exactly what created the problem. Meanwhile, Victoria tried to shift the conversation. She argued that she had acted in the best interest of the community and that everyone shared responsibility because the board approved the decision. But the records showed that she had been the person pushing the issue forward the most. She had presented the bridge as a problem that needed immediate action, and she had convinced others that waiting was unnecessary. I remembered standing beside that bridge on the morning it was removed. Victoria wanted me to react emotionally. She expected me to argue because she thought that would make her position stronger. Instead, I allowed the facts to speak. That choice mattered because once the official review began, there was nothing anyone could say that would change what the documents showed. Daniel contacted me again with another update. He explained that the agency had finished comparing the historical records with the HOA documents. The conclusion was clear. The bridge belonged to the government infrastructure system, and the HOA had no ownership rights over it. Now the remaining question was not who owned the bridge. That question had already been answered. The remaining question was how the HOA would address the consequences of removing something they had no authority to remove. For the first time since the entire situation began, Victoria could no longer rely on appearances, confidence, or influence. She had to face the one thing she had avoided from the beginning: accountability. The moment the official review confirmed the bridge was part of a government infrastructure system, the entire neighborhood began looking at the situation differently. For weeks, Victoria Beaumont had controlled the story. She had told residents that the HOA was protecting the community and removing a problem that should have been handled years earlier. But once the records were confirmed, the story she created started falling apart. The attention shifted from what happened to why it happened. The HOA board now had to answer difficult questions about their decision-making process, and many members realized they had trusted Victoria without asking for the evidence themselves. The first major change came during a special HOA meeting called to discuss the situation. The room was filled with residents who wanted answers. Some came because they were concerned about the financial impact. Others came because they felt they had been given incomplete information. Victoria arrived with the same confident appearance she always had, wearing another carefully chosen luxury outfit that matched her usual image of authority. But this time, the room was different. People were not there to listen to a speech. They were there to understand the facts. When the meeting began, several board members asked to review the documents that had been submitted during the investigation. The records were displayed for everyone to see. The ownership history, the government identification number, and the construction records all pointed to the same conclusion. The bridge had never belonged to the HOA. A silence filled the room as residents realized the decision had been made without the proper verification. Victoria attempted to explain that she believed she was doing what was best for everyone. She repeated that the HOA had received complaints and that she wanted to resolve an ongoing issue. But several residents asked the same question. Why did nobody confirm ownership before approving the removal? That question was impossible to avoid. The board members who had supported Victoria began admitting that they should have requested more information before voting. They explained that they trusted her experience and assumed she had already checked everything. But leadership was not about appearing certain. It was about making sure decisions were based on accurate information. As the meeting continued, another important issue came forward. The government agency requested that the area be restored according to the original access requirements. Because the bridge had been removed without proper authorization, the HOA needed to work with the responsible parties to correct the situation. This was no longer about proving someone wrong. It was about repairing a mistake that affected more than one person. I watched everything unfold from my seat and thought about how different the outcome could have been. If Victoria had simply reviewed the records before taking action, none of this would have happened. There would have been no investigation, no community division, and no questions about the HOA's judgment. But she had been focused on winning a disagreement instead of finding the truth. Over the next few weeks, plans began forming to restore the connection that the bridge provided. Engineers reviewed the location, officials studied the requirements, and the community started moving toward a solution. The same people who once believed Victoria had solved a problem were now watching a different kind of leadership take place. They saw patience, documentation, and cooperation replace assumptions and pressure. Victoria still attended meetings, but her influence was no longer the same. Residents who once accepted every decision without question began asking for records and explanations. The experience had changed the entire community. The bridge had become more than a structure. It had become a reminder that authority means nothing without responsibility. And as the restoration plans moved forward, one thing became clear. The biggest mistake was never removing the bridge. The biggest mistake was believing that confidence could replace the truth. Months after the investigation began, I finally stood in the same place where the old bridge had once connected my property to the outside road. But this time, the scene looked completely different. Instead of an empty space filled with uncertainty, there was a renewed sense of purpose. The restoration project had moved forward, and the community was finally seeing the result of choosing facts over assumptions. Watching the new structure take shape reminded me of everything that had happened. When Victoria Beaumont first ordered the removal, she believed she was ending a problem. She believed the HOA had complete authority, and she believed nobody would question her decision. But the truth was never about who spoke the loudest. It was about who had the evidence. The official records had revealed that the bridge was connected to a government infrastructure system that existed long before the HOA was created. The mistake was not simply misunderstanding ownership. The real mistake was acting before understanding the full story. During the final stages of the restoration, many residents who had once supported Victoria approached me and admitted they had never considered asking for proof. They trusted confidence instead of documentation. They trusted a person who always seemed certain instead of taking the time to verify the facts themselves. I understood why it happened because certainty can be convincing. When someone speaks with complete confidence, it is easy to believe they must know what they are talking about. But this experience taught everyone in the community an important lesson. Authority is not proven by how confidently someone gives orders. It is proven by how carefully they make decisions. Victoria eventually stepped away from her position as HOA president after more residents demanded better transparency and accountability. The community created new procedures requiring proper documentation before major decisions could be approved. Every request involving property, access, or shared resources needed evidence behind it. The neighborhood had changed because everyone had learned something valuable from one mistake. As for me, I did not see the situation as a victory over Victoria. I saw it as a reminder that patience and preparation matter. I could have reacted emotionally on the day the bridge was removed. I could have turned the situation into a public argument. But sometimes the strongest response is allowing the truth to reveal itself. The bridge was never just about wood, concrete, or a pathway across the land. It represented something bigger. It showed what happens when people make decisions without understanding the responsibility that comes with power. Today, when I cross that bridge, I think about the lesson behind the entire experience. A person can have a title, a position, and the support of others, but none of those things replace the importance of facts. The most important question is always the one that should be asked before any decision is made. Do we truly know the truth? After hearing this story, what do you think? Do you believe Victoria should have investigated the ownership records before taking action? Or do you think the HOA made a reasonable mistake based on the information they had at the time? Share your thoughts because every perspective adds to the conversation. And if you enjoy stories about property conflicts, unexpected discoveries, and moments when the truth finally comes out, consider subscribing to the channel so you can follow more stories like this one. Sometimes the biggest lessons come from the situations where nobody expects the answer to be different from what they believed.